Nebuchadnezzar. And that's what, no, I'm sorry, that was over Assyria. That's correct. Over Assyria and Egypt at the Battle of Carchemish, and King Nebuchadnezzar took the first group captive from Judah into Babylonian captivity. My slide had 586 BC last week, but it just said 606 BC. And that's including when Daniel went. So this is the conclusion of what we talked about last week. The second group was taken into captivity in 596 BC, and that included Ezekiel. And then King Zedekiah rebuffed Babylon, and King Nebuchadnezzar led then to the final group being taken captive in Jerusalem and the temple destroyed in 586 BC. So Babylon kingdom was centered in Babylon. You've got some information. There's a lot that would talk about the Babylonian captivity. So this actually is from the British Museum. It's actually a tile panel that was from Nebuchadnezzar's palace. I've seen it a couple of times. It's now been moved to someplace else. I don't know where, but that's just evidence of that. I think the important things of Babylon captivity that we're going to go into, we haven't talked about this yet, so I'm going to go into this, but there's important things about the Babylon captivity. The first is that Daniel prophesied that Babylon was going to fall to the Medes and the Persians. So we'll get to each of these. Jeremiah prophesied that the captivity was going to last 70 years, and Isaiah prophesied that Cyrus of Persia would free the Jews from captivity, which is the setup to the three books we're about to cover. This is the handwriting on the wall. You can go to Daniel and see that. We're not going to go to that in the whole account there, but just look at the last point. It says the kingdom's going to be divided. So he's talking to the king of Babylon, Belshazzar, at this time. He says the king's going to be divided. It's going to be given to the Medes and the Persians. So he tells him that's going to happen. And so it in fact happens that evening. It was that imminent when Daniel told him that. So you all know the story of the handwriting on the wall, but the significant thing is he's saying this Babylonian captivity, this Babylonian kingdom is about to come to an end. And it did that evening. Darius takes over, who is a Mede, and begins to rule the people. Belshazzar was killed that evening, and so he dies. One of the things I just found interesting in the historical context, just briefly, and again, I've said multiple times I don't need history to prove what I know God says is correct. But a lot said Belshazzar didn't actually exist. And then in the middle 1800s, they find a cylinder. Nabonidus is his father, and the cylinder talks about his eldest son, and it further talks about his ruling as a king. So this is one of the things a lot of people said the book of Daniel can't be real because this really wasn't a king who recorded in historical history, but yeah, he was. They just found it in the 1800s, and this cylinder points that out. It's actually in the British Museum. The second thing is that Jeremiah said that the whole land would be desolate and astonishment, and these nations shall serve the king of Babylon for 70 years. So we know the context now. Daniel says it's going to end. Jeremiah says it's going to have occurred in 70 years that this captivity is going to end, and you're going to serve Babylon for that period of time. And it'll come to pass when those are finished that the king of Babylon is going to be punished. So that's exactly what happened. That's what Daniel said was going to happen, and that's what happened. And this one is the one that's the most important of the three prophecies around this to me, and that's why I have to put this up here and talk about it a little bit. Jeremiah's prophecy occurred sometime between 626 and 586 BC. So Jeremiah remained in Jerusalem when he was prophesying, and when we get to Jeremiah, we'll talk a lot more about that. So somewhere at the beginning of the captivity or during the period of captivity is when Jeremiah says this is going to last 70 years. So you can't look at this as something that actually is written about. It was said before that kingdom even was established that it was only going to last 70 years. And so, in fact, that's what occurred, as I've shown already. But this one is even more unique to me. So Isaiah was a prophet between 745 BC and 695 BC. We're now in 586 or 536 BC, depending on how you want to interpret this. Isaiah prophesied, obviously through God, that Cyrus, A shepherd shall perform all my pleasure, even saying to Jerusalem, you shall be built, to the temple your foundation shall be laid. And Cyrus is going to subdue the nations before him, and will loose the loins of the kings to open them before him. And you've raised him up in righteousness, and I will direct all his ways. He shall build my city, and he shall let go my captives, not for price nor reward, said the Lord of hosts. So he's going to let the captives go back. So he's saying sometime 150 years to 200 years before this event occurred, he said this event's going to occur. There's going to be a king of another country, Persia. His name's Cyrus. And he's going to actually let my people go for no money at all, for no reason at all. So think about it. He says 150 to 200 years before that there's going to be this king that's going to be raised that's not going to be Jewish. His name's Cyrus, and he's going to free these people for no cost. Jeremiah says, and that's going to occur 70 years after they go into captivity. And Daniel says, you're going to go into captivity tonight. Because of your behavior, Belshazzar, your kingdom is going to be taken from you. You see the significance of those prophecies? Can you imagine if I sat here and told you today that 150 years from now, there's going to be a king of, pick a country, Egypt, named John, that's going to come free you from your captivity that will have lasted 70 years. You'd look at me and say, boy, he has lost it. You'd say, he's lost it. I know you would. You say, where in the world's Terry gone to, you know? That's exactly what happened. How can you not trust in the providence of God when you see that? To me, it's just amazing. So that gets us to the books. Here you go. It concludes at 2 Chronicles in chapter 36. It says the same thing, but let's look at the account in Ezra. Now in the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, there's that name, the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah might be fulfilled, so that Jeremiah's prophecy might be fulfilled. The Lord stirred up the spirit of Cyrus, king of Persia, that he made a proclamation throughout all his kingdom, and put it also in writing, saying, Thus says Cyrus, king of Persia, The Lord God of heaven hath given me all the kingdoms of the earth. He hath charged me to build him a house at Jerusalem, which is in Judah. Exactly what Isaiah said some 150 to 200 years before. Cyrus, king of Persia, says that's going to happen. 70 years after the start of captivity, Zerubbabel's about to lead people out. Esther's going to plead on behalf of the Jews. I call it a book of prophecy. Ezra's going to lead another group back. And Nehemiah returns to fortify the walls with the support of Artaxerxes, another king of Persia. I find that amazing to me. What's even more amazing to me is in the British Museum, this is Cyrus's cylinder, which was uncovered, I think, 1880, maybe, I can't remember, mid-1800s. You know what that cylinder says? I'm willing to let the people that are captive here to go back to their home and rebuild their own temple and take their stuff with them, their treasures with them. Isn't that incredible? Isn't that incredible? To me, this is one of the greatest things that I've studied. Now, when you know that, you know that's what's about to happen. So that's the point in history we're at. What Ezra, Esther, and Nehemiah are going to be the history of what happened when that occurred, after Cyrus's edict occurred. So we're going to begin today by talking about the going back to rebuild. We'll start with going back to rebuild the temple. Because it wasn't an event as simple as it may have seemed when I just went through it. Let's pick up again in Ezra chapter 1. Because I found this significant in my study. I found it interesting, I shouldn't say. I found it interesting in my study. This is one of those things I've read past before, and it just hit me this time when I was reading it again. After Cyrus has said that he was going to allow this to happen, in verse 2, he says, Who is there among you of all his people So who among you of the Jews is God with you? I mean, your Jewish God with you. Let him go to Jerusalem, which is in Judah, and build the house of the Lord of God. He is the God which is in Jerusalem. So what did he say there? He said, who among you would like to do this? That's basically what he said. The way we'd say that is, which of you, we're talking to this church that's going to go do something, well, which of you want to go do this? That's what he's saying. I've always envisioned when they were freed to go from Persia that they just all rushed and went back. I don't know why I had that view. I just thought, well, if you've been captive and you want to be freed from captive, you want to go back to your homeland. But that wasn't what happened. Cyrus said, which of you want to go back? Which of you want to go back? They actually had a choice in the matter of whether they went back or not. There wasn't a mandate for them to return. But then he said something else I found interesting in verse 4. Whoever remains in any place where he sojourns, let the men of his place help him with silver and with gold and with goods and with beasts, besides a freewill offering for the house of God that is in Jerusalem. So what is he saying to those that choose not to go back? What's he telling them to do? He's telling them to help with the work, isn't he? He's saying if you don't go back, then you need to provide not only for the house of the Lord, but you need to provide for the people that are going back. So he really gave them a choice. But his choice was either go or do something to help the people that are going. What do we say sometimes about our mission work today? We say, well, if we don't go do the mission ourselves, we can at least support somebody to go do the mission. That's kind of simple what Cyrus is saying there. He's saying to the people, if you want to go, go. If you don't want to go, then help the people that are going. Provide for them. And then he says that something else, and I'm not going to read all these, maybe just verse 7. Cyrus the king brought forth the vessel of the house of the Lord, which Nebuchadnezzar brought forth from Jerusalem. He put them in the house of the gods. So when Nebuchadnezzar overtook the southern kingdom, he gathered all the stuff out of the temple and he took it to Babylon, I guess still there. Cyrus is saying, not only can you go and rebuild it, not only should you help the people if you don't go, but also take all this stuff that came out of your temple back with you to put back in the temple. Now think about the prophecy of Isaiah. The prophecy of Isaiah said he's going to free you to go back, and he's going to do it without any compensation coming back to him. That's what happened. What did Cyrus ask for here? Nothing. He didn't ask for anything. He just said, not only go, not only support the people that go, but take back what was taken from you. You see, the prophecy of Isaiah was fulfilled exactly as it was written 150 to 200 years before this event occurred. Now you understand why I wanted to share that history with you. Cyrus did exactly what God said Cyrus, by name, was going to do. And that's what's happened. I haven't done so much of this in the study because it's been more of a historical context. That's been the intent of the study. But I just couldn't leave this part alone, so I just had to bring this up. The first thing we have as people is we have a choice to do something. Becoming a Christian is whose choice? Is it God's choice for you to become a Christian? No. Yeah, as Gerald says, it's my choice. So a little bit like those people, we have a choice today. Joshua says it's best, and we've covered this, you know. He said he and his house is going to serve the Lord. He had a choice. But he told those people, he told them, coming out before they go into the promised land, you got a choice too over who you're going to serve. The first choice is we choose to do something. And I could extend that beyond just becoming a Christian to we choose every day to whether we're going to work for the Lord or not, don't we? Isn't that our choice as to whether we do that or not? Those people had a choice to go do something. We got a choice today to go do something or not. The second choice that they had is they actually had to give up something, didn't they? He said, hey, if you don't go back, then you need to give something to support the people that are going back. And I just got to thinking about what it said about Moses in the book of Hebrews. I don't think it's 25. It is. Choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than enjoy the pleasures of sin. We have a choice, but sometimes being a Christian means you got to give something up. I think one of the biggest challenges is we want to be Christians without giving something up. I couldn't resist this illustration since maybe I just saw it clearly for myself for the first time of that Cyrus actually gave people choice and he asked them to give something up. And I got to thinking, well, who was the greatest at that? Our choices may not be easy, but reflect what Christ's choice was. Let this mind be in you, which was also in Christ Jesus, who being in the form of God, did not consider robbery to be equal with God, made himself of no reputation, taking the form of a bondservant and coming in the likeness of men, being found in the appearances of man, he humbled himself, became obedient to the point of death, even the death of the cross. Christ chose to give up heaven. Christ had to make a choice. And he came to earth. You say, well, did he have to make a choice? Well, he did. It sounds crazy sometimes, but I think it was Matt or Jordan recently was talking about Christ in the Garden of Gethsemane. I think it was here. And he prayed that if this, maybe it was in a different class, it may have been Dale's sermon, I can't remember. He prayed that if his cup could pass from him, let it pass from him, but God's will be done. Cyrus gave the people two choices. They involved making a decision to do something, and it involved making a decision to give up something. And I don't think life's much different 2,600 years from that point for us today. 25 to 2,600 years for us today. There's nothing more important than we can choose to be a Christian, live a Christian life. There's nothing more important than we can choose than that. But we need to know that those choices are ours, and there's something we have to do as a result of those choices. I just found it a great lesson from that many years ago. Let's move on to see what happens. Zerubbabel, who, by the way, is in the lineage of David. I don't know if I mentioned that. I mean, in the lineage of Jesus. I don't know if I mentioned that earlier. But Zerubbabel leads a group of people to go back. Chapter 2 and verse 1, it talks about them going back. It gives a listing in chapter 2 of those people that went back. It gets toward the conclusion of that, and it tells you how many people, actually, chapter 2, verse 64, how many people went back. 40 and 2,303 scores. So a lot fewer people than were in captivity, that's clear. It talks about what they carried back with them. But I found the interesting, and I really liked this after hearing what Cyrus had said to the people. It says, some of the chief of fathers, when they came to the house of the Lord, which is at Jerusalem, offered freely for the house of God to set it up in his place. So there was a freely given to the work of setting up the temple. Ezra, who I admire from my study of the book of Ezra in the past and today as well, but I just really had an appreciation for the way Ezra approached everything. The first thing he did is he builds an altar and he worships. Ezra relied on God from the very beginning. Chapter 3, verses 2 and 3, you can see what he did there to rely on God about the offerings that he did. In verse 11, it talks about that they sang together by the course and praising and giving thanks unto the Lord because he is good and his mercy endures forever. I'm chapter 3, verse 11 now. His mercy endures forever toward Israel. The people shouted with a great shout. They praised the Lord because the foundation of the house of the Lord was laid. So they have now built the foundation of the house, and after a period in this time of worship, they built the foundation, and they were pleased, and they were happy, and there were a lot of rejoicing as a result of that. But then something happened that was a little bit different in verses 12 and 13, which I also see as interesting. Many of the priests and Levites and chiefs of the fathers who were ancient men had seen the first house when the foundation of this house was laid before their eyes, wept with a loud voice. So the people could not discern the noise of the shout of joy from the noise and the weeping of the people, for the people shouted with a loud shout, and the noise was heard afar off. So what happened here is some people saw it. They thought about the previous temple, and it made them sad. So they actually wept. So when they started laying the foundation gave two different reactions to the people, some joy and some sad. I think that you just get in a situation like this where it's just, the people were weeping. What were they doing? They were looking to the past, weren't they? They were thinking about the past. They weren't looking to the future. They were looking to the past. I think we, if not careful, can find ourselves in that same category of looking to the past. While we're told there's nothing that can separate us from God and we need to look to achieve what God has us to achieve, when we see the fact that we can't be separated from God only by us, nothing else can separate us from God except us. But I find it interesting that even with that confidence sometimes, we look to the past and not to the future. We think about the things that's been missed. We think about the things we didn't do. I am guilty of saying, I call it, I remember the good old days, right? I remember the good old days. I look back. I sit with people my age and talk about what we did. The one that I hear is often guilty. Talking about what the youth group was like when my kids were little. And then I was reflecting on what we have sometimes here, 3 or 4 rows of youth. I'm thinking they probably compare quite favorably with the group of youth I'm thinking about. I mean, I'm so proud of these young people that sat down front here. Sometimes I think maybe I don't need to look to the past. I need to look to the future. I don't need to talk about the ways I used to talk to people or the programs we used to have. And I don't like using the word programs, but I want to use it for the sake of example. What I was encouraged by in thinking about this when I read this story is I need to look more toward what can happen. You see, the joy in those people when that foundation was laid is they could see the promise of that temple being rebuilt. They weren't caught up with what it used to look like. Those that wept, they were caught up with what it used to look like. I encourage all of us, when we think about the church, we think about this congregation at West End, we think about the church in the St. Louis area, we need to look to what we can do. What do you do with a foundation of 150 people and whatever number of youth we have that set up here? It's interesting, isn't it? It's interesting that when that temple foundation was laid, that you got 2 reactions. It honestly made me feel a little guilty. And it encourages me to think a little bit more about what we can make in our time, as opposed to what happened in others' times. They finally got past it, but it took a long time. Because what happened is they had opposition to building this temple. The Samaritans objected to it. You know, the Samaritans were put there when the northern kingdom was taken into Assyrian captivity in 721 BC or 722 BC. that happened then, and so Samaritans were coming in because they sent people down to mix with the Jews because they didn't want the Jewish nation in the northern kingdom to reestablish itself. So they objected to building a temple. It's obvious why they would. So they sent an edict to Cyrus has moved on now, and Darius is king at this time. So they sent an edict to appeal to Darius, king of Persia, and they say to them that, you need to be careful. You need to be careful if you do this, because if you don't stop these people from building this temple, then what's going to happen is that you're not going to have any say in what they do. Once they get to the temple built, you're not going to have any say in what they do. That's in chapter 4, verse 16. We certify to the king that if this city be built again and the walls are set up, by this means thou shalt have no portion on this side of the river. And so he's just using human nature to say, Darius, if you really want to control this, if you want this to be your territory, don't let them build this. Don't let them build this temple. You need to stop it. So as a result of Darius's edict, it was read. Verse 24, they ceased the work of the house of God, which is at Jerusalem. So it ceased until the second year of the reign of Darius, king of Persia. So there was a period of time there where the temple wasn't being constructed. The Jews start falling away during that time. There's prophecy from Haggai and Zechariah. You can read that in chapter 5. And so they've received a successful order. They stopped the construction. The work was ceased for a period of 15 years. And then they had more resistance in chapter 5. And another appeal in chapter 5 of adversaries to Darius to try to keep it from being built. And finally Darius said, okay, the Jews are saying there was this order from Cyrus, a previous king, Cyrus the Great, by the way, is the way they would refer to him. Cyrus the Great, previous king. So let's go see. Let's go see if is there really such a decree. And that's in verse 17. Therefore, chapter 5, it seemed good to the king, let there be search made in the king's treasure's house, which is at Babylon, whether it be so that a decree was made of Cyrus, the king, to build this house of God at Jerusalem, and let the king send his pleasure to us concerning the matter. So it goes ahead down in chapter 6. In the first year of Cyrus the king, the same Cyrus, the king that made this decree concerning the house of God at Jerusalem, let the house be builded. So this is his decree. The place where they offered sacrifices. Let the foundations be strongly laid. The height thereof be 80 cubits. And he goes ahead and describes that. Comes down to verse 7. Let the work of this house of God alone, let the governor of the Jews and the elders of the Jews build this house of God in his place. So in essence, what happened is they found the decree. So they found the decree, and they said, this decree from Cyrus said that they could build this temple. So it's reinstated then by Darius, the current king. So the current king reinstates the ability to build a temple. So there's been a long time between when we saw them go there and take stuff with them. It's been 15 years roughly 15 years of when that occurred and when this temple gets restarted. In verse 15 of chapter 6, it says, the house was finished on the third day of the month of Adar, which is the 6th year of the reign of Darius the king. And that's why I can give the time accuracy pretty correctly, because it tells exactly when it was finished, and there's historical context of when Darius was king. So in his 6 years, they in fact allowed it, and the temple was rebuilt and finished. At 17, they offered a dedication, the house of God, 100 bullocks. It talks about what they offered. In verse 22, it says they kept the feast of the unleavened bread 7 days, so they reinstituted some degree of worship there. For the Lord had made them joyful and turned their heart of the king of Assyria unto them to strengthen their hands in the work of the house of God and the God of Israel. So what has happened is that the temple's been finished. They're happy that the temple's been finished. It's been concluded with the support of King Darius. And we could read through this. And King Darius was very much similar to Cyrus the Great in that he allowed the people to go back and allowed them to be protected in order to rebuild the temple. And this is when it would get confusing a little bit, but this is when there's a pause. Because Ezra, if you go into chapter 7, this is a different time when Ezra is going back to Jerusalem. And in the meantime of that time frame, between chapter 6 and chapter 7, is when Esther appeals to the king of Persia on behalf of the Jews. So I'm going to shift to Esther now because I think it's important because there's three good lessons in the book of Esther. All of them you're probably familiar with. I think Esther, I'm sure all the women in here, because you've probably studied Esther multiple times, and everybody knows the story of Esther quite well, so I'm not going to go through the whole story of Esther. What I want to share with you is what's important about the book of Esther. So there's one thing unique to Esther to the rest of the books of the Bible. Do you know what the unique thing is about Esther compared to the rest of the books of the Bible? Somebody knows. I know. It doesn't mention God. Thank you. It doesn't mention God. It's the only book of the Bible that doesn't have the name God or Jehovah in it. But what I would say is it's got God written all over it. Somebody wrote a book and they said, God in the shadows. And said that's what the book of Esther was. God in the shadows. Esther clearly shows the providence of God. I'm not going to try to get into the providence of God, but it clearly shows the providence of God. And I want to make that out in one significant point when we talk about Esther here. So you know the story of Esther and how she became queen. So let me turn over here. We'll get to that. We'll go through that pretty quickly. But basically what happened is the king, I cannot pronounce this way, Ahasuerus. So that's the same, the name that you looked at in the Persia would be Xerxes, X-E-R-E-S, I guess, Xerxes, X-E-R. Did I put that up there? I think I did. Well, I did not. Xerxes would be the king if you look at that, X-E-R-X-E-S. That would be the king. That would be the same king. And so what happens is he throws a party. He's getting ready actually for his battle, to go into battle. And he's throwing this party. And he asks Vashti, the queen, to come to the party after they've probably become drunk and to show her beauty off. And so she didn't come, and which would not, sometimes we paint that as her being disrespectful, but it actually was out of custom for him to ask her to do that. That would not be a normal custom to how you would treat a Persian queen. But he did, and Vashti didn't come, and because of that, after pressure from those sitting around him and his embarrassment, he decides then that he needs to search for another queen. She's removed from her office, and it says in verse 19 of chapter 1 that Vashti could no longer come before the king, and that her royal estate's going to be given to somebody else. And that begins the search for a new queen, which becomes Esther. In the meantime, in chapter 2, Mordecai saves the life of the king. And so that's important because Mordecai treats Esther like a daughter. Although they were cousins, he treats her like a daughter. He's part of the one that appeals with the king through her. There's a guy named Haman that's elevated in authority with the king and has a confrontation with Mordecai. And that confrontation results to the fact then that Mordecai is hated by Haman because he won't bow down to worship Haman. Haman persuades the king to issue, this is the important part, persuades the king to issue a decree. In verse 13 it says, the letters were sent by post into all the king's province to destroy, to kill, and to cause to perish all Jews, both young and old, little children and women, in one day, even upon the 13th day, which is in the month of Adar, to take the spoil of them for your prey. So what happens in this edict, because of Haman's persuasion with the king, because of his hatred of Mordecai, because he wouldn't worship him, which had extended to the whole Jewish nation, he says, destroy all the Jews. Mordecai asked Esther to speak to the king on behalf of the Jews in chapter 4 and verses 7 and 8. So she's queen now. He sends, in verse 8, he sends a copy of the edict to Esther and says, you've got to do this. Esther says in verse 11 that if I do this and he doesn't raise his scepter out to me, then I could be killed. And Mordecai says to her, the three verses begin 13 is where I want to focus. And I'm hoping that's enough of the story for you to get the context. But Mordecai says, do you think you will escape? in the king's house more than all the Jews. So Esther's Jew, but the king doesn't know it. So Mordecai is telling Esther what? Do you think you're going to escape if this edict actually happens? Do you think you're going to live through this? He says to Esther, don't kid yourself. It's kind of like judgment, right? It's kind of like judgment for us, isn't it? Do you think you'll escape if you don't do what God tells you to do? Mordecai's telling Esther in that context, don't kid yourself. If the Jews are destroyed, you're going to be destroyed too. And then he says something that I know everybody studied in verse 14. If thou altogether holdest thy peace at this time, then shall their enlargement and deliverances arise to the Jews from another place. But your father's house shall be destroyed. And then this is a phrase that you've heard many times, I'm sure. Who knoweth whether thou art come to the kingdom for such a time as this? Esther, maybe God put you here for this event and for this time. I am certain that most of us in here can think of a time in life when we put in a situation for such a time as this. I can think about times I had the opportunity to teach the gospel and I didn't reach out. And I'm thinking now, well, maybe God put me there for such times as this. I'm not talking about something miraculous. You understand that. But sometimes God puts us in places in life for such a time as this. Here's the thing that I want to mention, and maybe we pick up here and talk about that context a little bit more next week. But here's what's important in this. So such a time as this is a great lesson for us with many applications, and maybe we'll touch on some of this. But what's important in this now, compared to the context of these books of history, is what? What happens if Esther doesn't appeal to the king? The Jewish nation's destroyed. Ezra doesn't go back a second time. Nehemiah doesn't go back and rebuild the walls. Such a time as this, you could say, was the saving of the Jewish nation. Without that, and the lineage that came from that, what happens to us today? Christ doesn't come. For such a time as this. I think there's great personal application. He does say there in that verse that God's providence is going to allow somebody else to arise. If you don't arise here, if you don't step up, God's not going to let this fail. So I don't mean to make it sound like that God's going to let it fail and His promises fail. Because He says, it just may not be you, but God's going to take care of this. But maybe this is God's way of saying, let's take care of this problem. So, great lesson from the concept of such a time as this. But I just want you to understand the importance of what that meant. And now I understand why the book of Esther is there, right? The book of Esther is there to tell us and show us God's providence in allowing the Jewish nation to be saved so that all the other events that occur after this occur. If that doesn't happen, then you'd say they may not occur, that's what I said. But the reality is they would have occurred some different way because God's made a promise. He's going to fulfill His promise. Like He makes promises, does He fulfill His promise? But Mordecai is saying, you're the way, maybe. Who knows? Who knows? Maybe you're God's plan. Now, do you ever think you're a part of God's plan? I do now. I think we're all part of God's plan, right? We're not put here just to exist. We're put here as a part of God's plan. And again, I don't mean anything miraculous. You understand that. And we can go to many New Testament verses that says we're part of God's plan. our responsibility to teach, our responsibility to encourage, our responsibility to care for the needs of others, our responsibility to bear the burdens of others, our responsibility to weep with those that weep and cry with those that cry. Be laughed, rejoice with those that rejoice. Christians, you're part of God's plan. And maybe for us, it's such a time as this. Yes, Don. Yeah, that's right. Yep, he is. Listen, I appreciate your attention. Just for those that might be listening, Don just said God's eyes are not his eyes. Is that correct? And his eyes are not God's eyes. And sometimes we need to see what God's seeing in us as opposed to what we see in ourselves. And that's a really great illustration. We'll conclude with that. We'll pick up here at this point in Esther next week, and we'll get through Nehemiah and conclude our books of history, not next week, but week after next. So I appreciate your attention in class this morning. Let's get ready now for our worship service.